I, F48, think I should go low/no contact with my sister, F41, and mother, but I need advice. Am I overreacting? I am quite torn about a family situation and am seeking guidance. I am contemplating severing ties with my sister and reducing or eliminating contact with my mother, yet I am uncertain if I am overreacting. I will attempt to convey the narrative as succinctly as possible to provide a complete picture. The brief summary is as follows. Am I the antagonist for desiring no contact with my sister, who believes she deserves the entirety of the inheritance after benefiting from free accommodation in my parents' house for over 20 years, and for feeling upset with my mother for supporting her? I am a 48-year-old female with a younger sister who is 41. After her birth, she encountered breathing issues, often stopping for no apparent reason, for several weeks, and it was miraculous that she survived, as the doctors dismissed my parents' concerns and offered no assistance. I was 7 years old at the time and vividly remember our family needing to monitor her around the clock. I even took shifts and witnessed her stop breathing while I was responsible for her, requiring my family's intervention. That was a traumatic experience for all of us, particularly for a 7-year-old me. My experience was never addressed in childhood, and it apparently influenced my parenting style, as someone pointed out how excessively vigilant and protective I became of my children, which I only recognized after it was mentioned. I was not a healthy child, and by the time my sister was born, I suffered from repeated infections that necessitated antibiotics and ultimately 2 surgeries to remove my tonsils and adenoids, performed without anesthesia back then. As a result, I was very traumatized and possibly did not speak to my mother for weeks due to the experience. However, after my sister recovered, she eventually outgrew her issues without treatment, thankfully. My parents remained overly focused on her. Even today, they express sympathy for her and constantly attend to her needs. When I inquired why she is constantly regarded as poor sister, I was told it was because of her childhood illness, and that has persisted for 4 decades. Yes, she experienced some childhood infections and was a picky eater like many kids, but I loved her deeply and continuously worried about her, even into adulthood, because it was ingrained in me that she needed care. I fully understand my parents' trauma from those early weeks of her life, yet I was frequently ill during my childhood, and I did not receive similar sympathy. I never resented this situation as a child because my concern for my sister's well-being outweighed all other emotions. In school, we both faced challenges. I generally performed well. My teachers often labeled me as very smart, very talented but very lazy in retrospect. I likely had undiagnosed AD or was on the spectrum. My sister's learning difficulties were more prominent, and she received assistance, while I was considered lazy and had to navigate my own challenges. Since childhood, my sister has often been quick to claim inability, manipulating others through her emotions to gain sympathy. Meanwhile, I had to be dependable and faced disappointment if I did not succeed. My childhood taught me to cope independently while my parents cared for my sister. This dynamic persists to this day. At 21, I moved abroad for work while pursuing part-time studies at university. I found myself in an abusive marriage but did not confide in anyone and struggled in silence. When I eventually spoke up, I was often told to stop being so stubborn and argumentative, to cease complaining about others, and to simply be a compliant wife. This is merely a side note. A few years later, when my first child was born, I finally mustered the courage to leave that unhealthy situation. Unfortunately, shortly before getting pregnant, I fell ill. As no one could determine the cause, it was dismissed as depression and anxiety, and the suggested solution was to engage in more physical activity and take antidepressants. I was very fit and had been consistently working out 3 to 5 times a week prior to becoming ill. This advice ultimately worsened my condition, just a note. Later, it was revealed I had a chronic neurological illness that was incurable, significantly diminishing my physical capabilities and leading to a long list of other systemic issues that severely restricted my ability to manage daily life. My strength waned, energy diminished, chronic pain escalated, and when I returned to work after a year of maternity leave, I could barely handle part-time employment and required support at home. Consequently, my parents moved in with me. My father had already been living with me before I had my baby because I secured him a job at my company, while my mother joined a year and a half later to assist with childcare after kindergarten. Both parents begrudged their help and frequently insisted I should get a grip, stop wallowing in self-pity, minimize my focus on my grievances, and deemed me a hypochondriac, among other criticisms. Eventually, I met my current husband, who is incredibly supportive. We had 2 more children together, and he is a wonderful spouse and father to all 3 kids. Regrettably, despite my hopes of improving, I continued needing assistance around the house and with the children, ultimately having to leave my job for health reasons after our 3rd child was born. For anyone inclined to suggest that I should not have had children while I was aware of my illness at that time, I had no foreknowledge of how debilitating this condition would become. I genuinely believed I would recover and did everything I could for my children, even if they were unable to go to the zoo or swimming with me, as they were able to participate with their father, and they know daily how deeply they are loved. Eventually, my parents moved out and acquired their own residence. My father continued to work while my mother was supposed to assist me on my difficult days. Even after I had received my diagnosis, my parents still viewed me with resentment and treated me as if I had chosen to feel this way. My mother would often become upset when I called to ask for her assistance on particularly rough days. We had provided her with a car, and they lived just 10 minutes away in the same town, since she preferred activities like sightseeing or shopping. She would sometimes come by, evaluate my condition, comment, "You don't look that bad today, so I won't stay," and leave me struggling. My husband worked full-time to support us, took the older children to school and kindergarten, ran errands after work, and handled the bulk of the household chores. I relied on my mother to watch my youngest child when I felt too weak and occasionally prepare dinner. It hurt deeply to feel her resentment. I had always been self-sufficient, relied upon by others for various responsibilities, and now I found myself in need of support. I must also indicate that despite my compromised condition, I still managed many responsibilities for my parents, even when it drained my limited energy, which meant I often lacked the capacity to care for the children and maintain the home for days. My husband was frustrated that my parents took advantage of me while behaving indecisively when we required their help. Eventually, we welcomed au pairs to live with us to alleviate the stress stemming from my parents' involvement. We subsequently relocated to a different country to be nearer to my husband's family. My wonderful mother-in-law has consistently been supportive of our situation. She helped care for the children when I needed assistance, transported them to school when I could not drive, prepared meals when I was unable to, and never made me feel guilty about my illness. She acknowledged that although she might not comprehend the illness, she sees its effects on me. Simultaneously, I continued managing various responsibilities for my parents, despite the distance: banking, insurance, taxes, correspondence, etc. My mother chose to divorce my father, which I fully supported as their marriage had been stagnant for decades. Since then, my mother seemed to have developed a warmer relationship with me, and we appeared to be building a friendly rapport. I surmised that since my sister disapproved of the divorce, her family being Jehovah's Witnesses, she was pleased to have my support. Addressing my sister, I must reiterate that she has always been quick to adopt a victim mentality and seek refuge in various situations. During visits, she would accompany my parents on day trips, return home, and lament feeling exhausted and unwell, prompting my mother to tend to her every need. Meanwhile, I would lie on the sofa, utterly drained and in pain due to my illness, after preparing an elaborate dinner and managing everything for everyone. The stark contrast was painful for me as I witnessed my sister skillfully playing the victim card, while my parents rushed to cater to her, while I was genuinely suffering yet continually strived to do everything within my physical capacity for my family and loved ones. On the rare occasions when I was forced to ask for help, the response was disdain and accusations. I despised requesting assistance. I had always prided myself on my independence. Seeking assistance felt like agony. I would rather exhaust myself than ask for help. Yet, with children as my utmost priority, I had to swallow my pride and reach out when needed. My sister, on the other hand, relished the attention. It is worth mentioning that she has never offered any form of support to my parents. I managed all their affairs, from paperwork to scheduling medical appointments and providing financial assistance. Fast forward to the present. A few years ago, I ceased contact with my father due to his unwillingness to sever ties with my abusive ex-spouse. Despite numerous requests, he repeatedly reassured me he would cut contact, yet he continued to do so. This became evident when he visited us over Christmas as usual, feeling obligated to care for him since he was alone, and called my ex to wish him a Merry Christmas while in my home. He was aware of my diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from that relationship and had directly witnessed some of the abuse. Consequently, I informed him that since he chose to maintain communication with my ex, I would no longer engage with him. It took some time, but we have resumed contact, and he visits periodically, including during holidays. Now, regarding why I may be perceived as the antagonist. My father resides in the family home that my grandfather constructed. It comprises 4 apartments, one for my grandfather, a 1-room unit, and one each for his 3 children, 3 3-room apartments. Upon my grandfather's passing 30 years ago, he bequeathed his apartment to me. While it was officially transferred to my father, everyone understood the intent was for it to ultimately belong to me, though it remains legally in my father's name. My grandmother inhabited the apartment until her passing, after which my parents rented it out. They attempted to give me the rent proceeds, which I initially accepted for a few months due to financial difficulties, but I insisted they use the money for necessary repairs around the house. Over time, my sister began residing there. I assume she stopped paying rent to my parents at that point. When my parents moved in with me for a few years, my sister and her husband occupied my parents' apartment rent-free, while my grandfather's unit remained rented out. Upon my parents' return to their home after my husband and I moved away, they again lived in that apartment. They intended to pay me rent, but I refused, as my sister was living rent-free in their apartment, and I did not want to charge my parents when they were not charging her. My father continues to live there now. When my parents divorced, they divided ownership of their apartment, but my grandfather's apartment remained under my father's name as they agreed it would eventually belong to me, in line with my grandfather's wishes. For years, I urged my parents to draft a will so that my sister and I would not end up in conflict. I had witnessed the turmoil that ensued among families and friends lacking a will. It creates rifts. Eventually, my father acquiesced and drafted will last year, stating that my grandfather's 1-room apartment would go to me, as per my grandfather's intention, and that the remainder, including my father's share of my parents' 3-room apartment, would be divided equally between my sister and me. This is where the drama began. Since my sister's family has occupied their apartment rent-free for about 20 years, my father proposed that they should either take out a loan or start saving to pay me off when the time comes. Upon hearing this, my sister called my mother in tears, expressing that they could not afford to pay me right now and that they were feeling stressed and worried about the future. My sister's family dedicates much of their time to their church, and her husband works according to their religious obligations with no pressure to work more or harder. My sister recently started a part-time job, but only within the last couple of years. My mother subsequently contacted me to express her sympathy for my poor sister, who was feeling distraught, and other matters. Without thinking, I called my sister to reassure her that it was not an immediate concern. I had no intention of demanding money at this moment, and suggested we calmly discuss future solutions. My sister declined to converse with me about it, and despite my repeated attempts to engage, she has not reached out. It became apparent that my sister was solely focused on playing the victim and drawing sympathy. I attempted to communicate my perspective to my mother, explaining that my sister had played on her emotions, and noted that she was uninterested in discussing this with me or collaborating on a resolution. My mother sided with my sister, stating she felt unsure about what to do, anxious about my sister's welfare, and asserted that since I insisted on formalizing these matters through a will, it was my responsibility for my sister's distress. It has become evident that my sister anticipated continuing to reside there rent-free and securing full ownership of my parents' apartment without considering me. My sister once again plays the victim in this unfair scenario, clearly aligning with my mother. I have attempted to clarify my reasoning with my mother. 1. The rationale for wanting them to create a will is to honor my parents' wishes and prevent future disputes. I have never made demands or claims regarding my desires or expectations for the will. 2. My sister has enjoyed rent-free accommodation in their apartment for over 20 years, with no official documents or rental agreements, while I moved out at 19 to work and always paid my own rent and mortgage, never receiving, nor expecting, anything for free, even having to take out loans during difficult times, and still facing a 25-year mortgage on our current home. 3. I have never voiced complaints or comments regarding my sister's rent-free living situation or the absence of financial support from them, nor did I ever assert any rights to my grandfather's apartment upon turning 18. 4. I have 3 children, my sister has 2, and I must consider their futures as well. I simply cannot afford to forego my inheritance because my poor sister weeps. I literally cannot afford to be benevolent, understanding, or kind. I have conveyed this to my mother through conversations and numerous emails, also expressing how she consistently supports my sister while disregarding how this affects me. However, she has not responded for weeks. Now, after I called to wish her a happy birthday 2 weeks ago, she has started sending me normal messages as if nothing has happened. She has not addressed my emails or the major argument. I have made several attempts in recent months to reach out to my sister via phone and text messages, but she has not replied. We arranged to visit our family in their country for a few days recently, and I provided multiple options for spending time together, especially for our children, and asked for their preferences, as our stay was limited. Each time, she responded with "make your own plans, don't worry about us" in various forms. She was primarily interested in a dinner at a restaurant that my mother was going to cover. I could not attend given that, after a long drive to their country, I would physically be unable to partake, yet I proposed treating everyone to a takeaway at our vacation apartment, which both my mother and sister denied and became upset over. My mother claimed she was merely trying to unite the family by organizing the restaurant outing, but since I didn't want to join, she felt disheartened. In my opinion, my sister has clearly indicated her desire for no contact with me. Thus, I made the decision to cease my efforts. Historically, I had always been the one to initiate communication, even if that was not always successful, but I now lack the motivation to continue. Curiously, a few days ago, following my conversation with my mother on her birthday, my sister sent me a message saying, "Long time no talk, how are you?" I have chosen not to respond and do not intend to engage. Regarding my mother, the last message I received was 3 days ago, and I also have not replied. It was something trivial about spring, flowers, and politics, just a normal message. Honestly, I am uncertain how or if I should reply. I poured out my feelings in my previous email, expressing how hurt I was and how, throughout my life, I have felt unfairly treated and invisible, how my sister constantly plays the victim, and about the will and inheritance. It is clear that I feel expected to remain silent and compliant. I am unable to simply revert to our previous normal conversations as though nothing has happened. I am hurt, but simultaneously, I now feel indifferent towards her. I am at a loss for what to do. On one hand, I feel bad about cutting off contact, yet I am unsure how to navigate this situation. I genuinely do not want to pretend any longer. What should my next steps be? Story 2. Choosing no contact with my sister and mother, after decades of one-sided support and unwarranted favoritism, felt necessary. I am quite torn regarding a personal dilemma within my family and am seeking guidance. I believe I want to cut off contact with my sister and limit or eliminate communication with my mother, but I'm uncertain if I am overreacting. I will attempt to recount the situation as succinctly as possible to provide context. In brief, am I the antagonist for wishing to avoid my sister after she expects to inherit everything, despite having lived rent-free in my parents' home for over 20 years, and for being upset with my mother for supporting my sister? I am a 48-year-old female with a younger sister who faced significant health challenges at birth, causing her to experience breathing difficulties for several weeks. My family had to monitor her constantly, and I, as a 7-year-old, also contributed to her care and witnessed her life-threatening episodes. This was traumatic for all of us, especially for a young child like me. My own experiences during this period were never addressed, and it seems this has influenced my approach as a mother, with others commenting on my hypervigilance and overprotective nature. As a child, I was not particularly healthy myself, suffering from recurrent infections that ultimately led to 2 surgeries for tonsil and adenoid removal, which were performed without anesthesia at that time. My parents remained focused on my sister's health even after she recovered, often expressing sympathy for her over the years. Despite experiencing my own health issues, I was never viewed through a lens of pity. I can understand my parents' trauma, yet it feels unfair that their focus remained solely on my sister while I also faced challenges. Throughout our childhood, she would often play the victim, manipulating others to gain sympathy, whereas I was expected to be self-sufficient and reliable. This imbalance has continued into adulthood, and when I moved away at age 21, I began working and studying simultaneously. I endured an abusive marriage but did not seek help, eventually finding the strength to leave when my first child was born. Sadly, illness struck just before my pregnancy, with symptoms misattributed to anxiety and depression, leading to inadequate responses from healthcare providers. Eventually, my condition was diagnosed as a chronic neurological illness, which has severely restricted my daily functioning. After a year of maternity leave, I could barely manage to work part-time, prompting my parents to move in with us to assist. However, they often expressed resentment towards my situation and criticized me for feeling unwell. I later met my current husband, who has been incredibly supportive, yet I could not regain my health and had to relinquish my job after the birth of our 3rd child. My parents have acknowledged my challenges, but still demonstrate a lack of understanding and support. We relocated to another country to be closer to my husband's family, who have been understanding and helpful during this difficult time. Even so, I have continued to manage many responsibilities for my parents, including financial and correspondence matters, despite living apart. My mother ultimately decided to divorce my father, and I supported her, which seemed to improve our relationship temporarily. However, it appears my sister disapproved of this change and sought to leverage my mother's emotional state. My sister is known for her tendency to elicit sympathy, often leaning on my parents and me for support, while I have consistently taken care of myself and managed our family's needs. I grew increasingly aware of the disparity in our treatment, frequently feeling undervalued as I continued to push through my health challenges. Years ago, I ceased contact with my father over his unwillingness to cut ties with my abusive ex-spouse. After some time, we resumed communication, but a rift developed over inheritance issues. My grandfather's will had indicated the intention that I inherit his apartment, yet it remains in my father's name. I made repeated requests for my parents to formalize a will to prevent disputes after their passing, understanding the toll such conflicts can take on familial relationships. Eventually, my father drafted a will, stating that I would inherit my grandfather's apartment and that my parents' shared property would be split evenly between my sister and me. This triggered a crisis when my sister expressed panic over how to finance my share once my parents are gone, exacerbated by her reliance on their support for 2 decades without any formal rental agreement or expectations of payment. Understanding her dismay over the prospect of having to pay me, my sister quickly enlisted my mother's sympathy, which led to a barrage of emotional calls from her regarding how poorly my sister was handling everything. In attempting to calm my sister, I reached out to her, hoping for a constructive dialogue, but she refused to communicate, indicating her preference for attention over resolution. My mother, siding with my sister, made claims that my insistence on formalizing a will was the origin of their distress. It became evident that my sister had assumed she could continue living there indefinitely while expecting full ownership of the apartment, seemingly disregarding my stake in the inheritance. Attempts to discuss this matter with my mother resulted in frustration, as she continued to emphasize my sister's worries without acknowledging my needs or perspectives. I reluctantly stopped trying to contact my sister, who had shown little interest in maintaining our relationship. Recently, she sent me a casual message after a period of silence, but I have no desire to re-establish communication. As for my mother, I have not replied to her recent messages, feeling unable to revert to a superficial relationship. In conclusion, my reluctance to maintain these relationships stems from years of feeling dismissed and manipulated. While I feel guilty about going no contact, I am unsure how to address the hurt and establish boundaries moving forward. So, am I the antagonist in this scenario?